How easy is it to just move to Canada? Especially if you're an American trans person thinking about escaping your own government trying to legislate you out of existence. Here's what you actually need to know, from what the process is actually like for immigrants coming to the Great White North to what's going on here in terms of LGBTQ2S+ rights. Okay, so I've been in the Canadian journalism business long enough to have seen many iterations of move to Canada trending online. It happened in 2016 when Trump was first elected, and people actually crashed Canada's immigration site. Again in 2020, then during the COVID-19 pandemic. Basically, anytime the US does something bananas, which is often, people want to move to Canada. I even wrote a whole guide about it for HuffPost back in 2020. But how feasible is moving to Canada, particularly for trans people trying to find something better in the land of ketchup chips and Carly Rae Jepsen? Despite advocacy from various groups, Canada does not currently have any program set up to specifically grant refugee status to transgender Americans. So if you're coming to Canada, you're likely going through our traditional immigration system. And there's a bunch of different paths for that. And to be clear, I can't cover Canada's entire immigration system in 3 minutes, but here's a brief overview. Americans can travel to and in Canada for up to 180 days with no need for a visa or other paperwork usually. But remember, you can't work here during that time. And if you want to stay longer or plan to work, you'll need a work permit. And there's two kinds: employer-specific, meaning you have work lined up with a specific employer, and an open work permit, which lets you work for almost any employer. But you can only get one of those under specific conditions, such as already being an international student in Canada, related to an international student, or if you're in the process of applying for permanent residency. And when it comes to permanent residency, there's a few different paths. If you're a skilled worker, you can apply for express entry, and there's different classes within that program for folks with work experience in Canada, internationally, and in specific high-demand trades. There's a point system and a lottery, but usually immigrants through this program have either lived in Canada for some time as international students, or on other kinds of visas, or have specific job offers in Canada. Also, the fees start around $1,500 Canadian and go up. Permanent residency is also possible through the provincial nominee program, which means you're sponsored by a specific province looking for specific skilled workers, students, or investors. You can also move to Canada if you have family here willing to sponsor you. A Canadian citizen or permanent resident can sponsor you if they're over 18, and there's a whole process for that. So, needless to say, moving to Canada is complicated, and not as simple as hopping the border and putting on a Blue Jays cap. But it's important to remember that even if you get through this whole process, Canada isn't all sunshine and rainbows and ice skating moose once you get here. On one hand, there's the whole Trump wants us to be the 51st state thing, which, you can take as seriously as you want. On the other hand, trans rights are also under threat here too. Canada will likely have our own federal election later this spring, and the Conservative Party of Canada is currently leading in the polls. Their leader, Pierre Poilievre, has parroted a lot of the same talking points as Trump around gender, and said he's in favor of banning trans women from women's sports, banning puberty blockers, and he espouses the idea that there are only two genders. Now, Canada is different than the US, and we're a parliamentary democracy, which means we don't do executive orders like the US, so things work a bit differently. But still, at the provincial level, we've already seen Canadian leaders roll back trans access to healthcare, sports, and safe spaces in schools. So whatever you do, make sure to understand the processes and possible complications that come from something as big as immigration. Because moving to Canada may seem great in theory, but in process, it can be a lot more complicated.